Welcome to the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. It is the world's only museum dedicated to preserving and celebrating the rich history of African American baseball and its profound impact on the social advancement of America. People come here expecting to meet some pretty good baseball players, and you're going to leave not being disappointed. You're going to meet some of the greatest athletes to ever play this game. You walk away with an even greater appreciation for just how special this country really is, because the story of the Negro Leagues could have only happened in America. Yes, it is anchored in the ugliness of American segregation, a horrible chapter in this country's history. But out of segregation rose this wonderful story of triumph and conquest, and is all based on one small, simple principle. You won't let me play with you? Then I'll just create a league of my own. Those leagues, the Negro Leagues, were formed right here in Kansas City. They helped make the game the global game that it is today. And quite frankly, the Negro Leagues didn't care what color you were. All they cared was, can you play? These athletes loved the game of baseball so much that they were willing to endure whatever social adversity confronted them as they traveled the highways and byways of our country just to play baseball. That passion would not only change our sport, but it would change our country. This wonderful, precious piece of baseball and Americana that escaped the pages of American history books. Countless generations of us went through our own formal educations without knowing one of the most significant chapters, not in baseball history, but in American history, the story of the Negro Leagues. By the time you've bared witness to everything that they endured just to play baseball in this country, then the very last thing that happens here is, now you can take the field.
Well, I am delighted to share the screen, I guess, in this virtual world that we're living in with some folks that I call my friend. They've been great supporters of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, but their friendship has meant the world to me and to our museum. And so I am delighted to have joined me as part of this Black History Month kind of discussion about the history of the Negro Leagues, the most recent Hall of Fame inductees from the Negro Leagues, 75th anniversary of the breaking of baseball's color barrier. And I guess we'll talk about a little bit of any and everything that they want to talk about. But it is my pleasure to welcome my brother, as I'm calling from another mother, my dear friend Joe Posnanski, the author of the best-selling Baseball 100, the 100 greatest baseball players in history. And I'm delighted that there are a number of Negro Leaguers that are featured in that book. And while that is a bestseller, New York Times bestseller, his best work ever will always be The Soul of Baseball, a road trip through Buck O'Neill's America. And if you haven't read that book, I would encourage you to get it. I personally believe that it should be a must read for every high school kid in this country because Buck's spirit comes alive in that book. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that as the program progresses. I'm also delighted to have with me one of the greatest pitchers to ever toe the mound. He too is a big time supporter and advocate of the Negro Leagues history in general and the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum specific. He is the mastermind behind a product line created by Roots of Fight that is now raising money in support of the Negro League Baseball Museum. He's a member of the coveted Black Aces, one of only a handful of Black American pitchers to win 20 games or more in a season. And he is a surefire future Hall of Famer. My pleasure to welcome my friend Cece Sabathia to the show. Cece, how you doing?
Good, thank you.
And of course, a man who needs no introduction. He is without question, I think, the greatest American filmmaker of all time. And the body of work is it is too extensive to even run through. But the baseball series, I think, is one of the greatest collection that brought, and I tell people all the time, Ken, if you don't know the history of this country, learn the history of baseball and you'll learn them both. You'll learn the history of baseball and you'll learn the history of our country. And that's what the baseball series, I think, beautifully captured. But more importantly, from a self-serving standpoint, it introduced America to a guy named John Jordan Buck O'Neill. and America fell in love with Buck. And it was just an amazing, joyous thing to witness. Please welcome the legendary filmmaker and a dear friend, Mr. Ken Burns. Ken, great to see you again as well.
See you, my friend. It's so good to be here, particularly under these circumstances.
Yeah, no, we were talking off camera. I haven't stopped smiling, ever since about 5:30 Central Time on December the 5th, when Josh over at the National Baseball Hall of Fame started to read that bio, and we all could exhale because we knew at long last, Buck was taking his rightful place in the National Baseball Hall of Fame. I want to ask each of you, and I know Joe was watching, and
I was watching.
Ken, you were watching. Cece, I don't know what.
Yeah, I was watching.
You were watching. What did you think when you heard the news? Joe, I'll start with you.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, look, this has been a long ride, right? I mean, that you and I were in the room there in 2007 with Buck when 2006 and with Buck when he fell short of the Hall of Fame, and it was really devastating. It was not devastating to him because Buck was always larger than all situations, but it was devastating to us. I mean, it was. I think anybody who really knew Buck and loved Buck just felt this incredible, anger, pain, whatever you want to call it. So, you and I talked about this many times leading up to the vote on December 5th. We weren't going to get fooled again, right? Like we kept saying, like, look, it looks good, it looks promising, but you know what? Until I hear his name, I'm not going to believe it. And so when they announced it, it was just so, it was so wonderful. And I know, I've talked with numerous people. Ken and I have talked about this. There is a little bit of bittersweet feel that Buck's not here to enjoy this. But you know what? I think he's enjoying it. I think that, at the end of the day, at the end of the day, I just kind of feel like this is nothing but joy. I mean, it should have happened long ago, but so what? It's happening now. And I can't wait to be there. I can't wait to be in Cooperstown in July when he gets elected. I mean, it gets inducted.
Ken, what were your thoughts in that moment?
I agree with everything that Joe said, and it's been such a long journey. But, as Buck, I think you said it really well. He always was bigger than any particular situation, any particular setback, anything. And he taught us so much about how to be as men, how to be as human beings. I said in the eulogy at the memorial service that our religious faith suggests that man is made in God's image, and there's almost nothing that we do that suggests that that's even remotely possible. And then you meet somebody like Buck O'Neill and you go, okay, well, that's something to tilt towards. That's something to aim for. That's a kind of way of being that I would like to be. And how he does it every single day. We'd be on the road promoting the baseball series in '94, and we get up at 5:30 and we'd meet somebody in the elevator, and he would greet them, "Come on, give me some sugar," right? Yeah. And talk to them as if he had woken up that day to meet them. And then I'd be dragging my tail back. It'd be 11 o'clock at night, and we were going to rinse and repeat for days and days and days. And he'd meet somebody in the elevator and he goes, "Oh, we were having a party. Well, let me just put my stuff down and I'll be right back down. Now give me some sugar," right? And he thought he had gotten up and had waited that entire day just to meet her. right? And everywhere along the way, at every step, whether it was somebody, a receptionist, or it was the interviewer or whatever, he was there. What I felt, therefore, when I heard the news and I was, my heart was pounding, I just felt all of the other men in the Hall of Fame have just been elevated. How lucky are they? Right? You just got to turn it around and say, Babe Ruth is a little bit bigger today. Ted Williams is a little bit bigger today. All these other people that are in that hall are a little bit bigger because now they are in the rightful company of somebody who we can say is a Hall of Fame baseball player, but is a Hall of Fame human being.
Yeah. And Cece, I know how much Buck meant to you as well. So what were your immediate reactions when you heard the news?
Yeah, just pure joy. I mean, just agreeing with everything that Ken and Joe just said is just joy and validation. And what Ken just said at the end there, just being a Hall of Fame player in person is something that, I feel like all players should strive to be. And, getting a chance to meet Buck at 20 years old, that was something that I wanted to be. Knowing him and knowing Mudcat and all these different guys that I had a chance to come across, just kind of molded me into what you saw, by the end of my career. So for me, it was just pure joy. I was sitting here watching it with my son and he was excited and it just validates, everything that we know about the man.
Yeah. I'll be honest, guys, and Joe touched upon this. See, I think in 2006, I was naive. I really was. I was naive because we went into this election process thinking that there is no way in the world Buck O'Neil is not going to get in.
Right.
This is a shoe-in. And if I didn't learn anything else 15 years later, I learned that there are no shoe-ins when you have a secret ballot and these kinds of elections. And so I was, as I told everybody, I was guardedly optimistic. But now understanding how these committees work, there was always this fear in the back of my mind. And initially, we weren't going to do the watch party. We ultimately ended up doing a watch party here at the museum because I was probably being a little selfish because I wasn't sure if I wanted to put myself back through the emotional toil that took in 2006, because we had so many people who had gathered here and everybody was awaiting this announcement. And then the verdict comes and it's not what we had hoped that it was going to be. And Joe talked about it. It was devastating. It was devastating. And I had to try as best as I could to try to compose myself and be a professional. And I didn't want to be a professional. No. I wanted to be mad and angry and and so I didn't want to be professional at all. And then he passes away later that year. And so that year has stayed with me, for the last 15 years. And I'm sure will stay with me through the rest of my life. And so I was prepared to watch this at home in solitude, not have anybody around me. And then whatever the verdict was, I knew I'd eventually have to address the media at some point in time. But, I was just going to watch it. I didn't want to be there and didn't want to be tearful. And in the 13th hour, I came to my senses and said, this is a moment in time that needed to be captured. Irregardless of what the outcome might be, we needed to do this. We needed to have people, his friends and fans, with us here in Kansas City. And we made a decision, and several hundred people came out to be there with us. And it was one of the best decisions, one of the smartest things I've ever done. And I think, too, Joe, that I finally realized that, look, if he doesn't get in, you're going to have a whole lot of shoulders to cry on. Yes. You won't be crying by yourself. You'll have a bunch of shoulders to cry on, or you'll have a bunch of people to hug. And as it turned out, we had a bunch of people to hug. And when Josh started to read the bio, as I mentioned, and I felt like, instantly the room knew. The room just exploded. And I felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off of my shoulders. And then I became, you start to reflect. You come into a reflective mode. And I'm thinking back to that 15 years ago. But this time, as I've mentioned, the tears in 2006, they were tears of anguish.
Right.
This time they were tears of joy. And I exhaled, and then I became, basically overcome with emotions. I had told myself, now, I'm not going to cry this time. That doggone Buck O'Neil makes me cry all the time. And I see our friend Bob Costas has joined us. Hello, sir.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
We can now hear you.
First of all, in the names of both Willie Mays and Mickey Mantle, I deeply, deeply apologize. I got I'm confused in my time zones. I didn't know if 1 o'clock was Central Time, which I assumed it was. If it was Eastern Time, I'm on Pacific Time. I'm just deeply confused. But at least I'm not where I have no idea what day it is, let alone what time it is.
We're glad you're with us, Bob. And we're just talking about hearing the news about Buck getting in finally after all those years. And what was your first thought?
My first thought was A, it's wonderful. B, it's about time. And then C, why didn't it happen when it should have happened, when he was here to fully enjoy and embrace it? But then, as I said on the Major League Baseball Network, which covered the announcement live, it was just another indication of what an exceptional and gracious human being he was, that not only did he not publicly gripe about it, and even privately, I understand from Bob, it was a murmur if it was anything. He told, when you guys were gathered there, he told everybody to feel happy about it and whatnot. And then the ultimate testament to how wonderful he was, the capstone of his life, he got up in Cooperstown when he should have been one of those with a plaque, and he spoke on behalf of his brethren. This is just an exceptional human being. So,
I'd like to think that I could have done that, but I'd be lying. I just don't think I could have done it. In a perfect world, I think we all, and I tell people all the time, I am trying every day, as best as I can, to be more Buck-like. And it's hard.
Hey, Bob, let's put it this way. If Buck was not available, you would have been 1A. Yeah. There wouldn't have been any debate about, if Buck was not available, there wouldn't have been any debate about who we go to. It would have been you.
but Bob brings up a great point, and Bob, Kendrick, you and I have talked about this many times. So my book came out the next year. I had saved my book, The Soul of Baseball, where I traveled around the country with Buck. I saved that for the Hall of Fame announcement because I thought that was the big finish. I thought he was going to get into the Hall of Fame, and that was going to be the big finish. And as we've talked about, I had it in my mind. I had the movie in my mind. I had everybody's characters. I had them already cast. I had Morgan Freeman as Buck, and I had this moment at the end where he was going into the Hall of Fame. And that was going to be, and it was going to be it, and it was going to be him smiling, and it was going to go to black, and that was going to be the way the movie was going to end. And so there was obviously we were devastated on so many levels, but for me, I thought, this really, what a downer this puts the book at the end, and then I realized exactly what Bob just said, so much more.
Yeah, so much more. I.F. Stone, the journalist, was asked by one of his acolytes. He was pretty left-leaning. I met him once in his late 70s or 80s. He said he was learning Greek and Latin so he could read the classics again in the original, and he did. But some acolyte was saying, how can you possibly admire Thomas Jefferson because of all of these things, including being an enslaver of other human beings? And he said, because history is tragedy, not melodrama. In melodrama, all the heroes are perfectly virtuous. All the bad guys are perfectly villainous. And life isn't like that. And so I think in some ways, however painful it has been for those of us who love Buck, this 15 plus year hiatus, suspension from it, it nonetheless is perfect Buck because he gave us an opportunity to give the kind of lesson that Bob just described. Like, who does that? Who can live up to those sorts of things? Who can love your enemy in the most generous way you possibly can and be so incredibly transcended in that moment. So maybe this is, as he would say, at the perfect time to be born, and in this case, born again.
Yep.
It's tragedy, but it's not melodrama. But in this case, for someone as heroic as him, it's okay.
Yeah, it shined a light. It shined a light on the kind of person that Buck O'Neil is. I mean, in so many ways, that is the ending. The ending is not Buck O'Neil going in the Hall of Fame. The ending is Buck O'Neil standing there and on behalf of all of those people, because that had been his life. That had been his life.
This is just the postscript. This is the coda.
That's right.
The climax was not getting in, and that's life. That's tough. None of us get out of it alive. And he was the best person I have ever met, who resembled, as I said, he actually resembled what a human being is supposed to be. And all of us hope, that in some ways, in a day-to-day way, Bob, Kendrick, how you can be more like Buck.
Yeah. No, I told people that I thought his finest hour of a career filled with fine hours, that his finest hour came in defeat. It actually came in defeat by the graciousness that he demonstrated that day, standing there on a platform in Cooperstown, New York, speaking on behalf of 17 others who didn't have a voice. They were all dead. And he became their voice. And I've oftentimes said that I think it's one of the most selfless acts in American sports history by far, what he did that day. Cece, I'm curious, do you recall the first time you met Buck?
Yeah, I do. It was my first time in Kansas City. I was 20 years old. I had just made the team with the Indians. And the very first time I walked out on the field in Kansas City, we walk out for BP to get ready to stretch. The Royals are hitting, and Buck is standing behind the cage. And he goes, "Hey, big fella, I've been looking for you." And I looked around and I was like, "Looking for who?" Like, no way this man knows who I am. You know what I'm saying? And he was like, "I've been looking for you. I've been waiting for you. I need to talk to you." And we sat there and talked behind the cage for like 15 minutes. And he invited me to come out to the museum. And that was the next day is when I met you, Bob, at the museum. And the friendship just kind of grew from there. And I loved hearing all the stories and, having the chance to walk through the museum at such a young age and understand, really what the Negro Leagues was. Because when I was a kid, you hear about the Negro Leagues and you just think I always tell you that you think it was just like backyard baseball. And, before, the baseball series came out, we didn't know that they were selling out stadiums or flying all around the country. And Satchel Paige had his own plane. Like, these were the elite athletes of that time. And, that story wasn't told to me until I met Buck. So, having the chance to meet him the very, very first time I went to Kansas City was a blessing.
It's very funny. There's a great story about CC's first time to Kansas City, because he doesn't know this, but he comes to Kansas City with Cleveland, and the Royals are in a very, very bad place, and Cleveland's very good. And CC pitches, and Frank White, who was who was coaching with the Royals at the time, he calls me over and he goes, "Why is it when Cleveland calls up a young player, they pitch like that?" Like, immediately. So that was that same trip.
Bob Costas.
Yeah.
Do you recall when you first met Buck?
Oh, yeah. In the 80s, the Royals were good. They were really good. They won the World Series in 85. They were in the playoffs on other occasions. So they were often featured on the Saturday afternoon NBC Game of the Week. And the Game of the Week meant something much different then than it does now with the proliferation of cable and the internet and everything else. That was the one game that was seen nationally. So Vince Scully and Joe Garagiola would do one half of the doubleheader, and Tony Kubek and I would do the other. So you'd get in on Friday. You'd go to the Friday night game. You'd hang around the clubhouses, the press box. You try and pick up tidbits at the batting cage and whatnot. And then Tony Kubek, bless him, because he introduced this aspect of it to me. He said, you want to sit behind the plate for at least several innings of the game, because that's where the scouts are. And you'll pick up stuff from the scouts, sometimes off the record. Well, Buck just happened to be sitting there, too. And like what Cece said, I mean, this is in the 80s. I guess I'd been on TV for a while, but it wasn't like I was a household name. It's like, "Hey, young fella, I've been following you." Oh my gosh. And then he sits me down and he starts telling me these incredible stories, which we've all heard, about Satchel Paige and about Josh Gibson and Oscar Charleston. And one of his favorite stories, I'm not saying that all these stories came together on one visit. We were in Kansas City a lot. And so I would sit with Buck at least for several innings each game. And a couple of times we went out to dinner with him, or he came up to the press box and we ate in the press dining room. So over time, I heard all these stories. And one of his favorites is one that he told Ken, among many, in the baseball documentary about Jackie Robinson taking the hose out of the tank. And Ken can tell it better than I can. So he had a way of telling a perfectly endearing story, and then without any rancor, telling you a story about the travails that he and his brethren had to deal with and ultimately surmounted.
Yeah, that's a really good example, Bob, of exactly how those stories work on so many multiple levels. Because again, he's giving the credit to the newbie, right? Remember, Jackie's there for one season, right? He's the kid, right? These guys have been around for a while and they know exactly what the deal is going through segregated, Oklahoma, on your way to Texas, segregated Texas to Barnstorm. And they pull up with their gas and they want to use the bathroom. Jackie wants to use the bathroom and nobody else would even think about it. And they've got these 250-gallon tanks and the guy, says, "Hey boy, you can't go there." And he says, "Take that hose out of the tank." And guy does the quick calculus and realizes he's about to lose 100 gallons of gas. Right? Even it was probably 17 cents a gallon, but it's a big deal. And so he says, "Okay, we'll be quick about it." So he gives all the credit to Jackie for that fire. But what happens is that they then see this as a way to integrate all the gas stations all the way down. And you realize, we're in February, which is our coldest and our shortest month, which is, I know why Dr. Woodson made why it's Black History Month, but it ought to be every single day. And what that history teaches you, as all history does, is that it's incremental. It's one gas station at a time. It's not necessarily, we pass this law, I'm signing the Emancipation Proclamation. That means everybody's free. It does not, right? Yeah. We pass a 13th and a 14th Amendment. That means everybody can vote. It does not. It just going to take the Buck O'Neills and the Jackie Robinsons and the unnamed people, the Rosa Parks and all of these other people that we've never heard of who make a gesture along the way that's going to change things significantly, which makes the story of the Negro Leagues, of Buck O'Neill and of Jackie in his 75th anniversary of his arrival on April 15th, 1947, that much more important, not just to this great sport that we love, but to all of American history and in some ways about human progress and human foibles. It's tragic, but it's also, we hope, a rising road.
And when you just sparks a couple of quick thoughts, Buck, in highlighting that story, and then the way you framed it, a couple of aspects to it, or at least one that was beyond what you said, but included in your film. Jackie Robinson may have only been there for 1 year, but he was college educated and came out of a different environment than many, not all, but than many of the Negro League players. And he had a streak of independence, which he had shown in the military when he risked court-martial and whatever else for standing up for his rights. So it was actually more likely that he, a rookie, would do that than someone who had been in the Negro Leagues for the entirety of their career. And then when you mentioned the 75th anniversary, we all know that on April 15th, everybody wears number 42. We got to cross our fingers for a number of reasons that they're playing Major League Baseball on April 15th, because we don't want that occasion to pass.
Yeah, no, you are absolutely right. And Bob, I think that perspective is right on, because that veteran Negro League player who, as Buck would say, had been so acclimated to segregation, they never would have been bold enough to do that.
Nope.
They just wouldn't have, because again, we talk about it. And I remember in context growing up in the Deep South in a small town called Crawfordville, Georgia. And I'm a kid in the 1960s. And I tell the story of how when we would go see my brother who lived in Atlanta, inevitably, every time we made that trip from Crawfordville to Atlanta, about 80-mile trip, and that was before Interstate 20, had been built. And so, Joe, the route to Atlanta then was on Old 78 Highway. And inevitably, Cece, my mother, who was a great cook, she would fry chicken, make some potato salad, make my favorite yellow cake with the chocolate icing. And we didn't call it white bread. We called it light bread. And you pack some light bread. But Ken, she would pack this in a shoebox, in a wax paper lined shoebox. And I don't know what it is, y'all, about that shoebox, but that was the best fried chicken. And it doesn't dawn on you. I'm too young at that point in time for it to really register with me. That
there's no place for you to eat along the way.
Or as certainly at least no place where they felt comfortable stopping along the way until they got to Atlanta. And so for that Negro League player who had been traveling the highways and byways of this country, mapping out safe havens, places that they could stop, they understood the complexities of this. Jackie had a defiant spirit, however, and as Buck would say, he said, I think you're taking some things that you don't necessarily have to take. Yes. And I think that is when we go back and we look at Jackie Robinson, and we talk about this all the time. He wasn't the best player in the Negro Leagues. He wasn't. No. You could argue that he wasn't the best player on his own Kansas City Monarch team. Right. Because you're talking about a team that still had Willard Brown on that ball club, and some other great stars, even though so many of the Monarchs players were serving in World War II, including Willard Brown. And so, but Hilton Smith was still on that club and a bunch of other people that were still outstanding baseball players. But that's what Buck always talked about. He was the right player to be the first. And that doesn't mean that other guys couldn't have done it. I think all of us got to know Monty Irvin at some point in time. Yeah. Monty could have done it. There's no question in my mind. Monty could have absolutely, because Monty had the same pedigree that Jackie had. And to be quite frankly, Monty was a better baseball player than Jackie was. Yeah, Monty was a superstar, Cece. There was absolutely nothing that the great Monty Irvin could not do. But I don't know if you guys are familiar with the story. Branch Rickey had tried to sign Monty Irvin in 1944. Yeah, matter of fact, he had really signed Monty in 1944, and Effa Manley stood in the way. That's right. Effa Manley owned the Newark Eagles, and she was prepared to fight Rickey on this, to legally fight Rickey. And Rickey really didn't need a fight on his hand. He didn't want to fight on his hand. And Monty had gotten back from World War II. And he says, too, that he was suffering from what they then called shell shock. Today, we call it post-traumatic syndrome. And felt like he needed to get his mind and his body right to be the first. But he could have very easily have done it. I think he would have succeeded at that level as well. But what we all know.
Do you guys think that Larry Doby could have been one of the first? Or he was one of the first, but do you think he could have been? You think he could have been the first? Jackie?
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. I'd be curious to see what the rest of the guys think about Doby, because he was an exceptional human being as well.
Yeah. You ask John Adams, it's really, these are all remarkable human beings, and Jackie stands before us because he happened to be, through circumstance, the first. And I think Bob is right. He was college educated, and interestingly enough, he had a temper that could have blown the whole thing. But Rickey also understood that he could understand the stakes and would have to control the time. I mean, it's going to kill Jackie. You look at the oldest picture of him, he looks like he's 85 and he's 53. I'm 68, Bob's 69. I mean, come on. That load that he carried was something else. But Jackie was able to do it. Brooklyn was the appropriate place to start. And Larry Doby ends up being the number 2, and it's just the circumstances of history with your, Cece, your Indians, so it's a complicated story, and lots of progress is being made on lots of fun. Bob is also right too that he had been court-martialed for doing something that Rosa Parks would do a decade later, that he had done a few years before, which is refused to give up his seat on a bus, a military bus in Fort Hood, and he was court-martialed and he was acquitted, but he decided to resign just because of what it meant. As a kid, he was refusing to leave the lunch counters in Pasadena when asked to leave. This is before, 15 years before anybody is organizing lunch counter demonstrations in Nashville or in other cities around the South on test cases. He's doing it all by himself. So in some ways, he's the perfect person, and he's got that character, he's got that drive, and he's never going to let up. He is never going to take his foot off the gas, even when he's released and people begin to treat him like, oh, well, he's ungrateful now, uppity, they would say, of course, in the racist terms of the time. He didn't care, and he gets out of baseball and he forms a bank, for a community bank, to make loans to Black people. I mean, he till the very last breath he took, he was committed to something that he had been, like Buck, you just sort of feel there's some divine intervention. And maybe in the end, Larry Doby wouldn't have been perfect in the way that Jackie was perfect. And maybe Monty Irvin, who I agree, much better baseball player. But we're celebrating a guy whose statistics don't put him in, but whose other qualities do. And that's, a little bit of
his statistics were good enough. I think it's 311 lifetime. It's rookie of the year. There was an MVP season in there too. Now there are guys that don't make the Hall of Fame who have those credentials, but it wasn't as if we put in a guy who was a 275.
I meant more Buck. I mean, Jackie, I think is
I'm sorry.
But I think that Buck, he doesn't have the numbers, but it isn't all just about that, right? I mean, Jackie may be borderline, but the fact of who he was and how he conducted himself just makes it obviously he's going to be elected. But Buck, that's where I think, sometimes the bureaucrats or the scribes, sort of can say, well, he didn't have the numbers, but we're not always talking about numbers. And Bob, you've said this, Costas, you've said this so much better than me about just what Buck represented to the game.
Since Ken brought it up, and it's incidental that I happen to do it, anyone can Google, I guess you put my name in and Curt Flood, and you'll see what I did. It takes about 4 minutes. You see what I said about Buck and Marvin Miller and Curt Flood and the mutual connections. And to the point that Ken made, that committee was so obsessed with numbers that they missed the bigger picture. How could they have left Buck out? How could you put 14 people in and one of them is not Buck O'Neill? And my point, to summarize, was that, look, if Marvin Miller was going to go in last year, then they should have had the foresight and the broader understanding to award Curt Flood the Buck O'Neill Award.
Yes.
So that Miller and Flood could be symbolically reunited on the stage. Miller always said, they'll never give it to me as long as I'm alive. He lived to be 95, and he was right. And even then, it was 8 or 9 years later by the time they got around to giving it to him. And Curt has been long gone, but they could have been symbolically united. That would have been the perfect touch, but that still doesn't mean they couldn't do it going forward. They could do another Buck O'Neill Award this coming summer, and Curt Flood, in my mind, would be an excellent person for it. And to kind of round out the point that Ken makes, and he knows this so much better than I, there's a great man theory of history, and that's often not nuanced enough. But there are great men and great women whose stories do amplify history and affect history. And it's often the person, the time, and the place. Larry Doby had to. Common sense tells us that if Jackie received racist taunts, if Jackie was subject to indignities, it's only months later that Bill Veeck brings Larry Doby to the Cleveland then Indians. He had to have been subjected to much of the same. And he, by all accounts, I didn't know him, I met him once, but by all accounts, he was a person of considerable character himself. So he must have had the forbearance to deal with it, but he's in a different place. Cleveland did go to the World Series in 48 and won it, and in 54 and lost to this guy. I always get confused. I have a bad sense of which this guy right there and his catch. But you think about those boys of summer Dodgers, and they're in the World Series all the time, and they're losing to the Yankees until 1955. And there's an element there of striving that kind of plays into the larger striving of a race and a country to come to terms with things. And it's in New York. You know, the Giants are good, the Yankees are good, and the Dodgers are good. You know, it's just an incredible baseball story. And there are some guys whose statistics are Hall of Fame worthy. And then there are others who, the minute you look at them, if you brought someone, and it's a bad example I'm about to give, I guess, because he was the only black player, but sometimes there are people, if you brought someone from Mars, they'd never seen an NBA game, you brought them to Chicago in 1995, their eyes would go right to Michael Jordan during layup drills, just right to him. You know, it was just something magnetic about him. So even after baseball was fully integrated, there were still guys like that guy and like Jackie Robinson, who even the casual fan who doesn't know a squeeze play from a sacrifice fly would say, I'm looking at that guy.
That's the guy.
I think I told this story once before on one of these things with you, Bob, and maybe I'm getting off the subject here, but to that point, and then I'll shut up. Before the Dodgers and Giants left New York, I'm 5 years old, and I don't think my father was this prescient, but he happened to take me to one game at Ebbets Field and one game at the Polo Grounds before they headed out west. So the Yankees became my team by default because by the time I was learning baseball, they were the only team and they were the greatest team. And Mickey Mantle was the best player in the American League, so he became my favorite player. The only thing I remember about the trip to Ebbets Field and the Polo Grounds is the atmospherics of it, how everything was in color, you know, instead of on a staticky black and white TV, and the whole atmosphere of it, the swirling cigar smoke, beer here, hot dog, the whole thing. I remember no particular except for one thing. We're in the grandstand at the Polo Grounds, and I'm on my father's shoulders. We're at the back of it, so I wasn't blocking anybody's view. I'm on my father's shoulders, and the Polo Grounds was one of those old structures with the pillars, so there were obstructed views and an overhang, and you're kind of going like this. And he goes, Bobby, that guy there, look at that guy there. And no, not that one. The one in the middle. That's Willie Mays. As if he was saying to his son, that's the Washington Monument.
Yes,
that's
right.
That's Willie Mays. And he was right. He was right. I remember.
Great. There is one other thing about Jackie Robinson you should say, because there were numerous players. Bob Kendrick, you as you well know, you've talked about this many times. Hilton Smith could have been first. Monty Irvin could have been first. Ted Strong could have been first. Willard Brown could have been first. Obviously, Josh Gibson could have been first. I mean, you want to go back.
Yeah.
There is something really interesting about Jackie Robinson that goes directly to the Negro Leagues and to Kansas City, and that is this. As great and incredible as Branch Rickey was, and as much of an impact as he made not only on baseball but in American history, he was not going to pay to get players from the Negro Leagues. He did not consider the Negro Leagues to be a legitimate league. That was why he wouldn't pay for Monty Irvin. Effa Manley would have been happy to sell Monty Irvin,
right.
But she wasn't going to let him go for free. The Kansas City Monarchs were owned by a white man, right. J.L. Wilkinson. And when it was time for Jackie Robinson, Branch Rickey didn't come to offer. He didn't say, hey, I'd like to buy out his contract. He just took him.
Yeah.
And J.L. Wilkinson had to make a very hard choice. He had Jackie Robinson under contract, but he knew what this meant for everyone. He obviously knew what this meant for baseball. They obviously knew what this meant for the civil rights movement that was not even begun in many ways. They also knew that he probably was not in a position where he could stand in the way.
Yeah.
And that's a really important part. If not, Jackie Robinson not only was the right person, the right time, everything about him, you know, he lifted his game. He as we all know, he was not a good baseball player in college. It was his third best sport at best, maybe his fourth. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But he was so driven, there was no way he was going to fail. He was going to succeed. So you have this incredible person in this incredible situation, and you also have somebody who was they were going to let him go.
I think it's understanding the moment, Joe. I think that's exactly what this is. You think about it with the sacrifice, as Bob is saying, that Curt Flood made. Even Marvin Miller was saying, wait, you know what? This is a little bit too early, right?
Yeah.
And it's going to end up being two white guys who are going to break open the plantation doors, right? And not Curt. And Kurt's that's it. He's the ultimate or Colin Kaepernick. And now you have Brian Flores taking an unbelievably principled stand, and he's messing up the PR of it. And you can see everybody closing ranks to sort of figure out how Brian Flores disappears when you've got this guy who won, last 6 or 7 straight games, had a winning record over the 2 seasons, is obviously a great, but all of a sudden now you're hearing, well, he's problematic. He didn't get along with this person. It's the same old story. And we just have, unfortunately, too many examples of, not just the perfect moment like Jackie or Buck, but also these imperfect moments in which human careers, if not human lives, are being placed at risk, but they're doing it in a conscious way. Curt Flood did it consciously. Colin Kaepernick did it consciously. And, and Brian Flores understood there was something bigger than football about this moment. And, Bob's got his new show is so fantastic. And I know that you guys will, take this up too and run with it, because Flores deserves somebody on one of his flanks helping him out in this moment.
Well, yeah, to your point, I was just on the phone yesterday with Howard Bryant, who's an executive producer of the show, and we put him on the panel the last show that we did. We were talking about how we're going to cover Flores, because we got to get at it with some additional insight. Right now, it's in a news cycle. It's kind of reporting what the facts of it are. But we want to have the right people, including Flores himself, if he'll be with us, one of the right people so that we can add some insight to it rather than just the facts of it.
Yeah, that's the important part.
Yeah, and the thing that I find so interesting, guys, about J.L. Wilkinson, whom, for the record, Buck O'Neil called J.L. Wilkinson, or considered J.L. Wilkinson to be the first white man he ever met without any prejudice. Said Wilkie did not have a prejudice bone in his body. And when there weren't enough hotel rooms to go around, they slept in the same bed together. That was J.L. Wilkinson. He was a 2000 man in the 1900s. And Wilkie was stuck between that proverbial rock and a hard place when they came to get Jackie Robinson. And that's what Joe was mentioning, because you can think about this. You play this scenario out in your head. If this white man who made his entire living in black baseball, if he's the guy that stands up publicly and blocks a black man from having a chance to go to the major leagues, he is damned if he did and damned if he didn't. And so publicly, Wilkie said all the right things. Privately, he is seething. He's not seething because a black man's going to play in the major leagues, but he understood that this black man that you're going to take away from me, you are going to put me out of business. And you talk about something that just drips with irony.
Yeah.
He signs Jackie, Ken, as you recall. He signs Jackie. They try him out in Houston, Texas.
Right.
Yeah, down in Houston, Texas, because Hilton Smith has seen him playing at Fort Hood. Well, the Monarchs had so many guys who are now in World War II. So Buck is in World War II. Hank Thompson's in World War II. Willard Brown is in World War II. Ted Strong serving in World War II. First and foremost, if they've got their full roster, I don't think Jackie ever gets invited to try out.
Right.
I really don't. That team would have been too good. I don't think he makes that team if he is invited to try out. And he makes the team, and little did J.L. Wilkinson know that he had just signed a man that was going to put him out of business.
That's the bittersweet news, right?
It is. It is. And Wilkie sold his interest to his business partner, T.Y. Baird, a year after Jackie takes the field, 1948.
He knew.
And of course, by that time, Wilkie had been in baseball for a long, long time, 3 decades in baseball. And I think he had grown tired. And again, he knew he couldn't fight it long. And so he sold his interest to T.Y. Baird, and he bows out gracefully, from that day. But Cece, to your point, Larry Doby. And we make the case that Jackie Robinson's breaking of the color barrier was equivalent to Neil Armstrong landing on the moon.
Oh, yeah.
At least it was, at least it was for Black folks. It was that way for Black folks.
I thought it was the sequel to our Civil War series. Because you have this outcome of the Civil War, right? And there's no real progress in a significant social way for, another 80 years. Yeah. And, that means that, this moment of taking the national game, football obviously integrated a little bit before that, but it's nothing the way it is now, professional football.
Yeah.
And, but baseball meant everything. It meant America, and everything that baseball did reflected the country. And so this seemed to us, and people thought we were crazy, but to me, you can continue to study American history as a sequence of presidential administrations punctuated by those wars, but you can also see it from different things. And baseball is a perfect barometer of everything that took place in the United States after the Civil War. And the rival of Jackie is Neil Armstrong, laying it on.
Yeah, nobody remembers. Well, I wouldn't say nobody, but everyone remembers Neil Armstrong, and the other astronauts aren't just second and third. They might as well be, as far behind as last place, because Neil Armstrong is the guy. And it does make a difference that then baseball was the unquestioned national pastime. Few people are familiar with Kenny Washington or Woody Strode, who were among the first Black players in the NFL. But everyone knows Jackie Robinson. On the last Super Bowl, there was a segment that began with Jackie Robinson and then took people back to familiarize them with the integration of the National Football League, or whatever it was called at that time. And just this last weekend, I guess it wasn't the one against the Bills, it was one against the Bengals. Jim Nantz mentioned, as you must know, Bob, he mentioned the Negro Leagues Museum and said to Tony Romo, next time you're in Kansas City, you have to go by and see this. So it has real resonance.
Yeah, and that's what we say. Larry Doby was our Buzz Aldrin. Now Larry, Buzz landing on the moon, and people seem to forget about Buzz. Buzz gets no love, and that's kind of how it's been for Larry Doby. Yeah, and really, it's only been over the last maybe decade plus that people have finally started to pay rightful tribute to Doby's pioneering role. His demeanor, however, was a little bit different than Jackie. Yeah, Larry Doby was a very soft-spoken guy. He was very quiet. And so there was probably concern about his ability to be able to handle the adverse social conditions. We needed Jackie Robinson. Yeah. We really did. We needed that guy who wasn't considered to be docile, even though he humbled himself greatly. But I think that made him the perfect person to take on this almost insurmountable task.
One of his good friends, and their wives were really close too, so their families were close, was of course Roy Campanella, right? One of the greatest baseball players, 3-time MVP at a time when there were so few Black Americans in the sport, just dominant player. But they fell out because Campy was just so happy to be where he was. And Jackie was, no, you can't. It's sort of like the dicta from Frederick Douglass when some young acolyte asked him, what did he recommend? He said, agitate. Somehow that came down to Jackie. And he became, disappointed. And Rachel was saying, it was very sad because these two men had been so intimately close, but Campy had chosen a different way of kind of just getting along. And Jackie was chosen for another purpose, and I don't mean to say chosen in such a, mystical way, but you begin to think in retrospect how these people like John Jordan, Buck O'Neill happen, and that you do feel that there's some larger forces at play. But Jackie understood that even in that, something had to be sacrificed, and in this case, it was a friendship with Campanella because he wasn't going to be pushing all the time. They celebrated Pee Wee Reese's birthday and played Dixie at Abbott's Field, and Jackie went berserk. berserk. What are you doing? This is like a racist tune, and and everybody's going, Jackie, relax. It's Pee Wee. He's from the South. It's okay. And he's going, this is 1950s. No, it's not okay. I mean, people say that today.
I can see that. I can see that from both sides, though. I can see Campy just wanting to be a ball player, get along, and be like everybody else. And I can see Jackie, from his side, wanting to be disruptive and letting people know that this stuff is not okay. So it's, being in the big leagues for so long and playing on teams where I was the only black guy on some teams, and then playing on teams where I had 8 other black guys on the team. You know what I'm saying? Like, at different times, I was both of those guys where, there was times where I was disruptive, and there was times where I was just happy to be there because I am comfortable, So I get both sides of that, of where they're standing.
And I find that point so interesting, Cece, because when we go back 2 years ago, and right after the George Floyd murder, and so many in the sports world were rallying around this cause, it was almost expected for NBA and NFL players to do this because those leagues are majority black. But then we get to Major League Baseball, and where you talked about maybe being certainly of only a few American black players in a locker room on any of those given franchises. And as I was having dialogue with those young men, and we were having these forums talking about social justice, civil rights, and to see these young African-American major leaguers take this monumental step, because I know they had to be stepping outside of their comfort zone.
Yes.
And when everybody else around you don't look like you do. And for them to say, okay, I've got to do this. I have now got to utilize my voice. But how beautiful it was to see their teammates
so great.
Come along with
Go along too. It was one of those moments. Yeah. It was really great.
I think
Go ahead, Cece. Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, just to that point, with this new generation of players, Mookie Betts taking a knee made it easier for everybody else to do it. He's our face. He's the biggest player. He's the best black player in the game right now. And when he went out and took a knee, it just relieved everybody. I remember getting on text with everybody, being on Zooms with all these guys, and they didn't know what to do, coming up on opening day. And, I was talking about Manfred. It was a lot of commotion. Nobody knew what was going to happen. And when Mookie took a knee, it just kind of eased everything for everybody and allowed the rest of these guys to go out, take a knee if you want. You don't have to if you don't want to. But him setting that bar as being the best player, I think, helped everybody in today's game.
Yeah.
See, what are your thoughts about the relatively low number of African Americans now in single digits? There was a time in the 1970s when it was between 25 and 28%. Now, in fairness to baseball, if you're talking about players of color, with all the Hispanic players and even bringing in Asian players, the talent pool has expanded. But for a variety of reasons, the number of American-born black players is about as low as it's ever been, and it's a concern.
Yeah, it is a big concern. And even, like I said, I seen it early in my career. It was, I got drafted in the late 90s, and I would go to spring training and it'd be, 50 to 75 black guys just in one organization, in spring training, running around. And as we got into the mid 2000s, I would look around and it would just be me in spring training and maybe a couple of other guys, So, with travel baseball and everything, how hard it is to get into the circuit and all these different things, I think it makes a difference for these kids in the community where they can just go out and play football, or it's easy to play basketball, and you can get a full scholarship to go to college and play those sports. Can't get a full scholarship in baseball. So somebody like me, I wouldn't have had a chance to go play college baseball because my parents couldn't make up, the rest of that scholarship for me to go play. So the way that it's structured now, we've kind of taken baseball out of the hands of the black community. And that's why we started the Players Alliance to try to, help with the grassroots. From the executive level in MLB all the way down to grassroots, I think we need to start making changes because, there is really no path for somebody like me now to get to the big leagues, which, and like you said, in the late 70s, early 80s, So all I seen was, Ricky Henderson, Dave Stewart, Dave Parker, like these guys that I grew up watching, they're few and far between now.
The Pittsburgh Pirates fielded in the 1970s an all-black team.
Yeah.
And they heard for it. I have there's a sad counterpart to this. In our Jackie Robinson biography, we had a few quotes that Jackie said that we needed read by somebody. Jackie didn't say it in newsreel. There was no recordings. We didn't want to paraphrase it. So we got Jamie Foxx to read. And as I'm doing the recording in LA, he starts reminiscing. He said, I was really good at track and I was really good at baseball and I wanted to be a baseball player in high school. And everybody said, no, track, you do track, don't do baseball. And he goes, no, I like baseball. So he gets sent over they said, okay. So he gets sent over to the baseball team and he's completely shunned. I mean, right field. Nobody talks to him, nothing. This is the 80s, right? How old is he, right? Maybe 70s, 80s, nothing. No contact, nothing from coaches, no advice, no nothing. And finally, he just gives up after a few months and says, okay, I'll do track. So somewhere along the lines, Cece, we have to address this. This is an outrageous thing. I mean, we understand this is also the story of opportunity. People have gone up and out. And as Bob said, Jackie Robinson just didn't bring in Black African Americans. He brought in Cubans and he brought in Hispanics and by extension, the Asian wave because of the barriers that he broke. But we now have an obligation to go back into the sport we love and just make sure that there are opportunities. Every year I give money to RBI, Harlem RBI, revitalizing baseball in the inner city. But find some way to incentivize Gerald Early, who's the great writer and scholar at Washington University in St. Louis and a big Cards fan, describes to me sort of walking out of a game one night. And he said some other brothers were coming along and they said, what were you doing? Were you at that game? And he kind of went, no, because if you were Black, you didn't go to this white entertainment, right? Mm-hmm. However many Blacks might be fielded, you just didn't do that. And so he found himself in this very complicated thing in which he was sort of denying the fact that he's a season ticket holder and a very unusually rare season ticket holder who's Black for the St. Louis Cardinals. I mean, it's so complicated and we've made it more complicated. And fortunately, in the tragedy of George Floyd, there were moments for people like Mookie to shine and to say, oh yeah, there's a leader that, you exhale and you feel like, oh, I can draft behind that example, just as we're together today, because there's almost nothing that Buck did that isn't worthy of us wanting to aspire to.
Well, and Ken, in fairness, one second, Bob, in fairness, there's always going to be at least some element of racism, subtle or overt. We haven't eliminated that. But in fairness, baseball wants the broadest talent pool it can possibly get. Okay, if Martians could play baseball, they'd want the guy on the field. Okay, so this is a question, as you say, of opportunity to play and even of cultural influences that Cece was alluding to and that your Gerald Early story connects to. And I know, having spent much of my adult life in St. Louis, that the Cardinals, this goes back to the 80s and 90s, the Cardinals with Willie McGee on their team and Ozzie Smith on their team, and the Cardinals of the earlier vintage when Gerald Early was a kid following them with Bob Gibson and Lou Brock and Kurt Flood and others, there's a lot to market there. And they tried very hard. And there were affordable seats. And still, I don't think they ever got above like 3% of their ending fan base. You can't account for who's watching on TV or listening on the radio, but only about 3%. And in fairness, I think that the majority of baseball is dealing in good faith here, but the answers are tricky.
I agree. And I didn't mean to paint everything in one broad brush. I just think it's funny the extent that we're celebrating people who've taken us so far. And at the same time, there's so many things that have us taking steps backwards as well. And we really have to find institutionally and culturally, we shouldn't be excluding talented Black players because they're Black in America, in Texas in the 1980s. We should be supporting them and saying, hey, really good job. Maybe we'd be missing Jamie Foxx as a great talent in Hollywood, but, and maybe he'd be in the major leagues. But I think we've got a lot of work to do. And Buck reminds us, of that.
Well, and I hope that an institution like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum continues to be that beacon that hopefully impacts in a positive fashion, which is one of the reasons why I think the relationship between Major League Baseball, MLBPA, and now, of course, the Player Alliance is so important.
Yes.
Because, again, from a historical perspective, this is the place where urban kids see themselves. They see themselves, and they see themselves in their full glory. And we talk about teams that had fan bases that were Black. We had owners that were Black. We had all of this exceptional talent that made up this league. And it gives them, even though, again, it's in a historical framework or historical context, it gives them maybe a little bit more aspiration.
Yes.
Because you got to see it.
Yeah.
You have to see it. And I think that is also really, really important. And again, the museum is working very diligently to be part of the solution. We all kind of understand the problem. And there are obviously various components of what has contributed to make it a problem. But now it's about addressing it and creating a solution. And I think we're on the right path.
Oh,
but,
I know you.
So, and I tell people all the time, now the one thing that we are not in this society is patient. We don't. We live in a microwave society. And of course, there's nothing fast about our game. It really isn't. And so the fix is definitely not going to be fast, but it's going to be steadfast. And we have to remain diligent and steadfast in this process. And I think we'll start to see the pendulum shift the other way. But I think Cece's right. Bridging that economic divide is going to be really, really important.
The scholarship thing is big. Yeah.
Scholarship thing is a big point for kids that and you got to incentivize kids playing other sports. Like a lot of the kids that are shuffled through and that they only play baseball year round. So we almost need a league where we incentivize the other kids that play baseball and basketball. Basketball and football, and give them an opportunity to get seen too, because a lot of these kids are going to these showcases at different times when some of the better athletes are playing football and basketball at that time. So if we can incentivize a league where it's it's all dual sport athletes and we can make up some of those scholarships, I think we'll start to see some of these kids in the inner city start to play. I feel like I got lucky growing up in NorCal, and where I grew up in Vallejo, it's the inner city, but we all played baseball. That was our sport. So I seen it every day. Like my little league was nothing but Black kids. And that's literally all we played. So to Bob's point, they have to see it. And that was always me on the mound with the big baggy uniform and the hat to the side, because I wanted the kids in the Bronx and the kids in, that's watching the game to know that I'm just like you. I wear my clothes just like you. I'm just like you. And this is a sport that's for you too. You know what I'm saying? So that was always why I, did some of the things I did when I was playing.
Yeah. I'd like to ask each of you, because I don't think I've ever posed a question to any of you before, maybe Joe and I in conversation, but what drew you to the Negro Leagues? Who introduced you all to the Negro League? Cece, was it your first trip to the museum, or someone talked to you earlier about the Negro Leagues?
No, it was my grandfather. He was a Jackie Robinson fan, obviously. And he loved baseball. He was a big baseball fan. But he only told me stories about Jackie Robinson. Only reason I knew about Larry Doby is because I got drafted by the Indians. And, so he the stories that I heard of the Negro Leagues were only stories about Jackie Robinson or the stories that my grandfather knew. So yeah, my real education came from meeting Buck and you, and when I really got a chance to come to the museum.
Yeah. Joe, what about you?
Well, I think I've long had sort of a fascination with the Negro Leagues through Satchel Paige, right? Just you hear the stories of Satchel Paige, and I was always drawn to these incredible stories. But no question that I met Buck O'Neil for the first time because of Ken Burns, and Ken brought Buck to the All-Star game in Pittsburgh before the baseball series came out. And I'd never heard of him. I had never heard of Buck O'Neil. I had no idea who he was. I wasn't working in Kansas City then. I had no earthly idea that, where our future would go. But, Ken brought Buck in. They talked for a little bit, and then they, as they will in these situations, they each split up to go and be surrounded by reporters and tell some stories. And Buck went over to a corner, and I said, okay, well, I'm going to go start with Buck, and I'll get back to Ken. And Ken, no offense, I never got back to you. No.
Why would you? Why would you?
Because Buck was so incredible, so fascinating. Instantly, there was this joy about him, and the stories. He was the greatest storyteller you could possibly imagine. And then, of course, within a couple of years, less than 2 years later, I was working in Kansas City. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum was being built. It was Buck O'Neil was already, a legend in town, and then it built from there. But it was really, that was probably the first time I ever wrote about the Negro Leagues. Was that time I met Buck O'Neil at the Pittsburgh All-Star game. Yeah,
Pittsburgh.
Yeah. Bob, what about you? What drew you to the Negro Leagues? When did you get introduced to the Negro Leagues?
When I was in high school, I read everything I could get my hands on. Even before that, as a grade schooler, I read everything I could get my hands on about baseball. And I read a book by Robert Peterson entitled "Only the Ball Was White."
One of the great titles of all time.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's a great book.
Yeah, so I was interested in it, and I knew probably more about baseball history than most people did. By the time I was, 10 or 12 years old, I was following it, and that filled out my understanding to some extent. And I was lucky enough, Ken knows this, I was lucky enough to have known Buck O'Neil before Ken introduced him to most of America because of those sessions in Kansas City at the ballpark and him telling these stories. I mean, forget about it. This guy was one of the most gifted storytellers you could ever imagine on any subject. Okay, I mean, I'll take a liberty here. Shelby Foote was central to the Civil War. He's also in the baseball thing. Shelby Foote was great. Shelby Foote can't compete with Buck O'Neil as a storyteller. And Shelby Foote is not only in a story, he's a great character. He's a great storyteller. But it's like, I don't know, you can pick anybody. Guys, lots of guys are in the Hall of Fame that are in his class. Buck was in a class of his own, and you just wanted. This was, if you were a kid, this is the guy you wanted to tell you a bedtime story.
Yeah.
Right? You wanted to listen to the lilt of his voice, and then of course he would tell you some stories that were maybe not, especially at that time, publishable or
about Nancy and Lahoma. Yeah.
Nancy and Lahoma is one of the greatest stories of all time.
One of the greatest stories of all time.
Correct. But the way he told it elevated it. It wasn't like, oh, this is the down and dirty part.
No, it's just what happened.
Yeah. So, Buck filled it out, and Ken was there, and so was Rachel Robinson. I was honored to be one of the people that hosted the opening of the Negro Leagues Museum. So, and I've been back many times. Regrettably, not in the last few years because I'm not doing football anymore. And baseball, the Royals are, pretty good and have had their moments, but I don't think baseball has taken me to Kansas City very often. So I'd have to make a pilgrimage. But I used to stop by pretty regularly when my travels took me to Kansas City. So I know you probably added some elements, and I'm interested to see them when I get a chance again.
Yeah, no, we're looking forward to that. Ken, what about you?
Well, I think it was, only the ball was white. We were interested in telling a complete story. We saw baseball as a much bigger story than just games won and lost, careers rising and falling. And that meant dealing with Jackie as the kind of the center of it. But to deal with Jackie was to also understand how African Americans were excluded, which is why we're so thrilled that not only Minnie Minoso, but Fowler's in there. The only true connection to Cooperstown that there is in baseball is actually with the black man. There's nothing about Cooperstown that has to do with the invention of the game, except that now we have a Hall of Famer who's from the Cooperstown area, and that makes it right. So I think it was understanding we had to tell about the exclusion of African American, Moses Fleetwood Walker, Bud Fowler, others in the late 19th century, and then the so-called gentleman's agreement that obtained, but then understanding that there's a separate but parallel athletic league with Rube Foster and the Negro Leagues and all of that story culminating, and then continuing in a bittersweet fashion afterwards, after Jackie comes up. So it was that, and meeting Buck. Lynn Novick went down to Cooperstown and interviewed several. She goes, but there was this one guy, and that one guy, we just kept interviewing. And we went all around, Joe, that summer of 94. We went all around the country. And I remember we were in Austin, Texas, doing something with the PBS station. The PBS manager there, now deceased, really wonderful guy named Bill Arhos. He was single A, double A guy. I hope his family I didn't get it wrong. Maybe he was triple A, but he was talking about all of this stuff that he was doing. And we drove down to Lockhart, which is a big, barbecue capital south of Austin, and driving back with a tornado forming to our west as we were heading north from Lockhart after having the three of us pigged out at barbecue. Buck started telling some of the stories that I hadn't even heard on film, and, hitting for the cycle, all of the stuff. And you were all kind of looking off to the left, but Buck was great. I was in the back seat because Buck was up. Of course, Bill was driving. And it was one of the, of all the moments, and I've got so many that I love. One of the best was just listening to Buck, slow up. He was going to hit for a cycle, and he had another inside the park home run, but he's damned if he's good. So he comes up a little bit late, right? How does he tell about, he has to come up and stop at third base. So he's got the hit for the cycle, and a couple of more kind of more, how should we say it, less family oriented Satchel Paige stories. And, I'm so happy that he lives, and this just gives it more life, this honor. And so we were there from the very beginning at the Negro Leagues, and so happy to see that happen, as Joe was and Bob was. And of course I segued from that into making a film about jazz. And so, there they were, the museums wedded together. It would seem like, Kansas City was, every time I made a film, I had to be in Kansas City, the center of the universe.
Bob, you know who else told me a lot about is Bob Feller, who told me, talked a lot about the Negro Leagues, and talked a lot about Satchel and the stuff that they would do in the off season. So I spoke a lot to Bob Feller about the Negro Leagues too.
Yeah, no, Bob.
They had, as there were teams, like Bob Feller had a team and Satchel had a team.
Yes.
And it was a big draw, and they played pretty close to a draw. They played 100 times, like 50-50, or I think the Negro League players had an edge, but it was close enough that it was really competitive.
Yeah, no, it was, and that was 1946. And Buck used to talk about this in glowing fashion. He says, for 17 days of work, 1946, he and his teammates could earn $7,000 apiece. They were filling up those ballparks. He said he was making so much money, his wife thought he was stealing. And it is widely believed that Feller and Satchel, who were great, they were not only great promoters, they were great self-promoters, that they may have made close to $100,000 off that tour, and so, but that's what Buck made us feel. He gave it, and I think that's why Kenny came across so genuine and with so much authenticity in baseball, because as he always said, you allowed him to tell the story the way that he remembered the story. Yeah, as opposed to others who wanted him to tell the story the way they thought the story would have been.
I'll start to cry, but he stopped me in O'Hare one day, and he just said, I left, and he said, I've been telling this story for a long time, but until you did it, nobody listened. And I want to thank you. And I'm going, Buck, it's you that we have to thank for opening up this world and making it real, as he talked about, traveling from black sections of town to black sections of town, carrying the news, sometimes being at black owned hotels with the jazz, the touring swing bands that we're doing, so that there was a kind of cultural connection of knowing where you could stay if there was no place to stay, what families would take you in, the shoe boxes of fried chicken that would be brought to the games because they knew that you hadn't eaten on that 500-mile trip from the previous game to tonight's game. And do you have a place to stay? And the making real of this world that, most of us just can't even imagine could have possibly been true, but was just true for almost everyone in the country below the Mason-Dixon line and even above. It was such a gift to the country for him to share that whole experience of what it was like. And one thing we haven't talked about is how different black ball was, in terms of its speed and stealing bases and bunting and not waiting for Babe Ruth to hit a home run, but moving people along, and how exciting and dynamic that was, and how much the national pastime became that. And to me, say, Pete, what's your favorite era? Is it the 20s or the 30s? I said, you can't even start the clock running until Jackie arrives.
So 1940s.
So you can't say what's the best era, because clearly we were missing some of the greatest players that ever lived, denied a chance to play because of the color of their skin. So to me, the clock starts on the greatness of baseball on April 15th, 1947, 75 years ago.
And that's what I remind people, because if Jackie doesn't succeed, we don't know how long it would have been before another black player would have gotten the opportunity. And so if it's 20 years later, we don't get the guy that's behind Bob's shoulder.
Or Hank Aaron.
Or Henry Aaron. Or Ernie Banks.
Bob Gibson, yeah.
Bob Gibson, Roberto Clemente. Can you imagine our sport without those great stars?
Our world.
No.
Yeah. And I tell people, if you can, you could imagine what it was like before 1947.
Exactly.
Because they didn't learn how to play baseball after 1947.
Yeah.
They were playing baseball well before 1947. And to me, that's the thing. And I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to say, we were talking about Larry Doby and Cece and I, and I know you guys knew him well, but we lost a really good friend last year in Jim Mudcat Grant. Yeah. And one of my favorite Mudcat Grant stories, he was Larry Doby's roommate. And so when he first gets into Cleveland, he's rooming with Larry Doby. And he says he is a nervous wreck. He gets to the room before Larry gets in the room, and he kind of puts his stuff down, and he just sits down in a chair, and then he hears the door opening, and then here comes Larry Doby, who he said looked larger than life. And Larry Doby introduces himself. I'm Larry Doby. He said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Doby." He said, "Do you like which bed you want?" He said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Doby." "Do you like to watch anything on TV?" He said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Doby." He said, "Look, you got to stop with this Mr. Doby thing." He said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Doby."
That's great.
He was a special guy, and again, one of so many that we've lost over the last 2 years. Yeah. You guys are special guys, and I can't thank you all enough for sharing some of your time with us to talk about these things that we've talked about now. I can't believe how fast time has flown through the midst of these conversations, but we owe a great deed of gratitude to each and every one of you. This museum would not be what it is today without having those like yourselves who continue to support it, who continue to talk it up. And we're so excited about the future of this organization. Buck Spirit is still very much alive and well here in this museum. And as long as I've got any say in the matter, it will always be alive and well here at the Negro Leagues Baseball.
You preach it. You preach it.
Yeah, no, I don't know if either of you guys have any closing remarks. Please go ahead.
Only thing I'd say was the greatest thing in all the world is loving you. You know? Right? Repeat after me. The greatest thing. Great. Let me hear you. I don't hear you. The greatest thing
in all my life
is loving you.
Don't make like you did at the seventh inning stretch in the baseball doc. Some of us can carry a tune better than others, and I'm in the latter category.
And you know what, Bob? Every time I hear him saying, "Take me out to the ball game," I get goosebumps.
Yeah. Nobody sings it like Bob.
And you cannot not smile.
No.
Because it was just pure joy. It was joy exuding from Buck as he's singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." It was just precious. It really was. And again, guys, any closing remarks any of you guys have? This is
Bob. I'm sorry I arrived late, but I knew within about 10 seconds that you guys were doing just fine without me. I'm just happy to jump on the train while it was already moving.
Cece?
No, I just want to say thanks. I mean, this is great to be on the panel. I can listen to you guys talk all day. I mean, I love the history of baseball and love the Negro Leagues. So anytime you guys want me to do anything, I could just sit on here and listen. I don't have to say anything. I just want to hear the story. So thank you.
And Joe.
I don't know what there is to add to it. Obviously, we could talk about Buck and the Negro Leagues for hours and hours and hours and hours and never even scratch the surface. It's so important. The only thing I want to add is something that I tell all the time when I try to describe how great the Negro Leagues were and how great the players in the Negro Leagues were and what we missed. And you talked about it. You talked about that stretch of time after Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson comes along and Larry Doby comes along and Roy Campanella comes along and Willie Mays comes along and Hank Aaron comes along, Roberto Clemente comes along and Ernie Banks comes along. That stretch of time from 1947 and 1959, when finally the Boston Red Sox get their last. Yeah. Those 12 years, there are not just, as Bob would say, not just Hall of Famers, not just inner circle Hall of Famers, but the best of the best of the best. Clemente, Mays, Aaron, Campanella, Banks. I mean, these are Frank Robinson, yeah. The legends of the legends, the ones that would go to the Hall of Fame and all the other Hall of Famers would be looking at them, right? Mm-hmm. And so you wonder, wow, that's 12 years. So 1935 to 1947, what did we miss?
Yeah, what did we miss? What do we miss? My only comment would be just thanks to you, Bob Kendricks, for keeping this going every day of the week. You know, we're happy to be guests in this. We believe it with all of our soul and might, but you actually do the work every single day. And we're so proud of the museum and proud of the work and the way that you articulate the stories behind the stories. And of all the people on this conversation, you're the closest to Buck in every way, sense of the word, of being a really great human being. And we're just so happy to know you and hope that you'll call us when you need help. And we'll see you when you don't too.
And Bob Kendrick, when it comes to storytelling, nobody equals Buck, but you come pretty damn close.
Pretty damn close.
You took the baton. You were in the on, and he handed it off to you.
Yeah, he did.
I appreciate it, guys. I want to thank my friends over at Dick's Sporting Goods for creating this platform, for their generosity and support of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. I want to encourage everyone, if you haven't made your way to Kansas City and your travels bring you here, please stop in and see this great museum. It is, I think, a life-altering kind of experience. And then to learn more about the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, please visit us at www.nlbm.com. And you can go online, and we hope that you'll consider becoming a member of our team or maybe support in any way that you see fit. But more importantly, keep loving and talking Negro Leagues history. And we hope our paths cross sometime real soon. Guys, thank you all so much. This has been so much fun. Really,
thanks, everybody. Good to see you all. Good to see you.
Thank you, guys.